What if the person holding your hand in a hospital bed was already counting the days until you were gone? What if she smiled at you, and that smile was not love, but relief? Before we go any further, hit that like button, tap subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today, because what you're about to hear will change how you see the people closest to you. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's call the man Arthur. Arthur Hale was 71 years old, and for 43 of those years, he had built wooden boats with his own two hands in a small coastal town in Maine. He started with nothing but a rented shed, a second-hand table saw, and a stubborn belief that people would always want something made properly instead of something made cheaply. He was right. By the time he slowed down, Hale Boatworks employed 31 people and had a waiting list 2 years long. Arthur's first wife was named Helen. They built the business together, raised 2 children together, and buried a lot of hard years together before things finally got easier. Helen died of a stroke 9 years before this story begins, and something in Arthur went quiet after that. He kept working because working was the only language grief let him speak. He kept the lights on in the workshop because an empty house at 6 in the evening felt like a wound that never closed. 3 years after Helen passed, Arthur met a woman named Diane at a fundraising dinner for the local hospital. She was warm, she was clever, she laughed easily, and she seemed genuinely interested in a tired old boat builder who talked too much about varnish and not enough about himself. Diane had a grown son from a previous marriage named Ryan, 28 years old, who called Arthur Pop within the first month and asked him for money within the second. Arthur saw some of it. Most people do. He noticed how Diane asked about his will within the first year of marriage. He noticed how she referred to his boatyard as our business long before she had ever set foot in it. He noticed how Ryan disappeared for months and then reappeared exactly when rent was due. But loneliness has a strange power over careful men. It convinces them that noise is the same as love, and that company is the same as being wanted. So Arthur stayed quiet, and he stayed married, and he told himself that most of what he was seeing was simply his own grief talking. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, everything changed in the space of one sentence from a doctor. Arthur had been having stomach pain for weeks, pain he kept blaming on old age and bad coffee. When it finally became too much to ignore, Diane drove him to the regional hospital in Portland. A scan was ordered. Then another. By evening, a young doctor named Dr. Patel stood at the foot of Arthur's hospital bed holding a tablet against her chest the way people hold things they don't want to drop. "There's a mass near your liver," she said carefully. "And there's a serious infection alongside it. We need more testing before we understand the full picture, but I want to be honest with you both. This could be very serious." Diane's hand found Arthur's on top of the blanket. She asked the question before Arthur could even process what he'd just heard. "Are we talking about weeks? Days?" Dr. Patel hesitated the way doctors hesitate when they're choosing which version of the truth a person can carry. If the infection continues to spread rapidly, and if the mass is what we are concerned it might be, his condition could decline very fast. "I can't give you an exact number, but it's possible we are talking about a matter of days." The word days landed in that room like a stone dropped into still water. Diane's fingers tightened around Arthur's hand. Her eyes filled, right on schedule, the way a kettle boils once it hits the right temperature. After the doctor left, Diane sat beside the bed and performed grief beautifully for about a minute. She smoothed his blanket. She kissed his forehead. She watched his eyes drift shut under the weight of the pain medication, and she assumed, wrongly, that he had drifted somewhere far away, somewhere he couldn't hear her. That was her mistake. Because Arthur wasn't asleep. He was floating just beneath the surface of consciousness, aware enough to hear every word, too heavy with medication to open his eyes or move his hand. Diane leaned close enough that he could smell her perfume cutting through the antiseptic smell of the hospital room, and she whispered 4 words that would rearrange the rest of his life. "Finally. It's almost over." A moment later, Ryan walked in, glanced at his stepfather's closed eyes, and said, low enough that he thought no one but his mother could hear, "I already told Casey I'm taking the workshop truck this weekend. No point letting it sit there." Arthur didn't move. He didn't blink. He lay perfectly still and listened to his own heartbeat pound behind his ears while the 2 people who were supposed to love him most quietly divided up his life like it was already over. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, you already know that feeling. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's just a quiet, cold understanding that the ground beneath you is never as solid as you thought. Arthur lay in that hospital bed for the rest of the evening, saying nothing, giving nothing away. Every muscle in his body wanted to sit up and demand an explanation. Every instinct told him to wait. Around 7 that night, an old friend appeared in the doorway. His name was Sam Delgado, and he had worked beside Arthur at the boatyard for almost 28 years. Officially, he was the shop foreman. Unofficially, he was the closest thing Arthur had to a brother. Sam had driven 2 hours from the coast the moment he heard Arthur was in the hospital, still wearing his work jacket, still smelling faintly of cedar shavings. "You look like something the tide dragged in," Sam said, dropping into the chair beside the bed. Arthur almost managed a smile. "Nice to see you too." Diane and Ryan had gone downstairs for coffee, giving Arthur and Sam a rare stretch of privacy. Arthur waited until he was sure they were gone, then told Sam everything, the diagnosis, the possible days remaining, and finally, in a lowered voice, what he'd overheard. Sam went very still. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to comfort. He simply listened, the way he always had, all the way through. When Arthur finished, Sam leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Tell me exactly what the doctor said." Not what Diane heard. What she actually said. Arthur repeated it as precisely as he could remember. A mass. A serious infection. More tests needed. No confirmed diagnosis yet. Sam nodded slowly. "My uncle had something similar 4 years back. First scan looked like a death sentence. Turned out to be a bad abscess, not cancer at all. You don't know what this is yet, Arthur. Nobody does." "I know what Diane thinks it is," Arthur said. "And I know what she wants it to be." Something in Sam's expression hardened. "That's the part that should scare you more than the diagnosis." Arthur looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Then help me find out the truth before she decides it for me." Sam didn't hesitate. He already had his phone out. "I know a specialist in Boston who reviewed my uncle's case. Let me make a call." If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to hear it, and stick around, because what happens next will surprise you. Over the following 2 days, Arthur discovered something he hadn't expected. Being the patient gave him more power than 4 years of marriage had ever let him believe he had. When a nurse asked who was authorized to request Arthur's medical records for a second opinion, the answer was simple. As long as Arthur was mentally competent, only Arthur could authorize that release. Not Diane. Not Ryan. Him. For 4 years, Diane had slowly trained Arthur to run every decision through her first. Which restaurant they ate at. Which friends were too tiring to visit. Which invoices from the boatyard needed her opinion before he signed them. Somewhere along the way, Arthur had confused avoiding arguments with keeping the peace, and he hadn't noticed how much ground he'd given up until he was lying in a hospital bed realizing his wife had been quietly rehearsing his death. He signed the release for his records to be sent to Boston. Diane walked in 20 minutes later carrying a canvas bag and a folder of paperwork, wearing the face of a devoted, exhausted wife. "These are just routine forms," she said, setting the folder on his lap. "So I can handle things if you get too weak to manage them yourself." Arthur looked at the first page. Durable power of attorney. The second page gave her broad authority over his financial accounts. The third allowed her to speak to the boatyard's business partners on his behalf. "I'll have my attorney look these over first," Arthur said, closing the folder. Diane's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes went cold. "Ruth doesn't need to be involved in this. It's just practical." Ruth Alvarado had been Arthur's attorney for over 15 years, long before Diane had ever entered his life. "If it's practical," Arthur said, "she won't mind reviewing it." Diane took the folder back a little too quickly. "You're not thinking clearly right now. You're scared." That sentence frightened Arthur more than the diagnosis had. Not because it was true, but because he understood, in that moment, exactly how useful that sentence could become to her if she said it often enough, to enough people. That afternoon, while Diane went down to the cafeteria, Arthur called Ruth from the bathroom with the sink running so Ryan wouldn't overhear him from the hallway. Ruth's voice sharpened the moment he explained what he'd overheard and what Diane had tried to get him to sign. "Do not sign anything," she said. "I want your doctors to formally document that you are alert and capable of making your own decisions. And I want to review every authorization Diane already has access to." "Can you come to Portland?" Arthur asked. "I'm already getting my coat," Ruth said. "Arthur, are you safe there?" Arthur looked at the closed bathroom door. "I don't know yet." 2 days later, Dr. Rebecca Chen from Boston called after reviewing Arthur's scans remotely. "There is definitely an abnormal mass near the liver," she said, "but I don't agree that the imaging alone supports a terminal diagnosis. This pattern is also consistent with a severe infected abscess. We need a biopsy before anyone uses the word terminal." Arthur gripped the phone. "So I might not be dying." "You might not be," Dr. Chen said. "But the infection is dangerous, and we need to move quickly regardless. I recommend drainage, a biopsy, and aggressive antibiotics, starting today if your hospital team agrees." Diane was furious when she found out, though she dressed the fury up as fear. "You're putting yourself through unnecessary suffering," she said, standing over the bed. "For what?" "For an answer that's actually true," Arthur said. "Even if it changes nothing." Then at least it will be my answer, he thought, but didn't say. The procedure happened that evening. 48 hours later, with Diane at home showering and Ryan downstairs getting coffee, Dr. Patel sat down beside Arthur's bed and delivered the words that split his life into a clean line of before and after. "The biopsy came back clean," she said. "No cancer. What you have is a severe infected abscess, caused by a complication we are still working to fully understand. It's dangerous, and you'll need weeks of treatment. But Arthur, you are not terminal." Arthur sat in silence for a long moment, letting the sentence rearrange everything he thought he knew about how much time he had left. Relief hit him first, so hard it actually hurt in his chest. Then, right behind it, came something else entirely. The memory of Diane's whispered voice. Finally. It's almost over. The memory of Ryan asking Casey about the workshop truck. Sam arrived 20 minutes later and pulled Arthur into a careful hug the moment he heard the news. "Then we tell them tonight," Sam said, his jaw tight. "I want to see her face when she hears it." But Ruth, standing by the window with a briefcase, shook her head. "If you confront her right now, she'll say she panicked out of grief. She'll deny every word of it. And we still don't know what she's already set in motion behind your back." "I don't want to spend this second chance playing games," Arthur said quietly. "This isn't a game," Ruth said. "It's protection. You get one chance to do this properly. Don't waste it on a moment of satisfaction." Arthur sat with that for a long time. Then he asked Dr. Patel to tell Diane only that his condition had stabilized and that additional results were still pending. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth, the same currency Diane had been spending on him for years. If this story is pulling you in, now is the perfect time to hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the way this family's secrets come apart in the next few minutes is something you do not want to miss. Arthur was discharged 5 days later, not because he was fully healed, but because the infection was under control enough to continue treatment at home through a portable antibiotic pump. Diane hugged every nurse on the floor on her way out. "You have no idea what this means to us," she told them, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. Arthur knew exactly what it meant to her, and it wasn't relief that her husband was going to live. The ride home was quiet. The old farmhouse Arthur and Helen had bought 30 years earlier still looked the same crooked mailbox, the same oak tree Helen had planted the year their daughter was born. Everything looked untouched. Only Arthur had changed, or maybe he had simply started seeing clearly what had been there all along. "I'll get the guest room ready for you," Diane said as soon as they walked in the door. "Why not our room?" Arthur asked. "You'll rest better on your own while you're recovering," she said, already halfway up the stairs. It wasn't worth an argument yet. Not that night. Arthur woke before sunrise the next morning. An old habit from decades of 6 a.m. starts at the boatyard. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a person listen harder than usual. As he made his way carefully downstairs with his cane, he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Diane. Ryan. Neither of them knew he was awake. The realtor can come look at the place next week, Ryan was saying. Not yet, Diane answered. People will talk if we move too fast. Let everyone feel sorry for us a little longer first. The market's strong right now. We'll get more if we wait until after. And the workshop truck? Ryan asked. Cases still interested. Sell it once things settle, Diane said. And that old sailboat of his in the barn, the one he never lets anyone touch. Someone at the marina already asked about it. Arthur stood frozen on the stairs. That sailboat wasn't just wood and canvas. Helen had helped him build it, plank by plank, over 3 winters in the barn, insisting on the pale blue trim because she said it matched the color of the bay in October. After Helen died, Arthur hadn't been able to look at that boat for almost 2 years. Now Diane was negotiating its sale before his body was even fully healed. He returned upstairs before either of them noticed him, and for the first time in his life, his own staircase felt like enemy territory. A few days later, Sam arrived carrying a small rosemary plant, which he set beside the back porch without a word. It was an old signal between them from years of quiet business dealings, a way of saying, without saying, that the next step was in motion. Ruth had finished drafting the documents Arthur needed. The plan was almost ready. That same evening, Diane climbed into bed beside Arthur for the first time since he'd come home. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. I've been thinking, she whispered. We should invite everyone over this weekend. Family, old friends from the boatyard. Just in case. Just in case, Arthur repeated quietly into the darkness after she'd fallen asleep. She wanted witnesses. A final gathering. A story she could tell later about how devoted she'd been. Arthur lay awake listening to the old clock in the hallway strike midnight, one slow chime after another. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like it was counting down to his death. It felt like it was counting down to the day that Truth would finally walk through his front door. By Saturday morning, the plan was almost complete, but not without a scare. Ruth arrived early through the side door so Diane wouldn't see her car from the upstairs window, carrying a leather folder of final paperwork. One signature was still missing, from the bank, confirming a change in the boatyard's ownership structure. It might not clear until Monday, Ruth warned. Monday is too late, Arthur said, glancing toward the ceiling, where Diane was upstairs getting ready for what she was calling his little gathering. Sam, pretending to fix a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen, spoke without looking up. You don't have to do this today. I do, Arthur said. Once she gets in front of a room full of people and starts telling her version, I want the truth already locked in place. By 10 that morning, a mobile notary Ruth trusted pulled into the driveway. Arthur signed the final documents at his kitchen table while Diane supervised flower deliveries in the next room, completely unaware. His hand shook as he signed, partly from weakness, partly from the strange grief of ending something, even something built on lies. Can you tell me, in your own words, what you're signing? The notary asked gently. Arthur explained it clearly. The employee ownership transition. Sam's earned partnership stake. The removal of any spousal authority over the business. The notary nodded, satisfied, and the papers were done. At 10:15, Ruth's phone buzzed. The bank had confirmed. Sam let out a breath he'd clearly been holding all morning. So did Arthur. By noon, cars lined both sides of the road outside the farmhouse. Diane had gone all out. White lilies on the dining table. Framed wedding photos propped beside trays of sandwiches. A slideshow played silently on the television. 4 years of vacations and holiday dinners with Diane smiling beside him in every frame. Helen wasn't in a single photo. Neither were the early, hard years of building the boatyard from nothing. 40 years of Arthur's life had been quietly edited down to only the years Diane had been present for. Old friends from the boatyard arrived, along with neighbors, a pastor Arthur barely attended church with anymore, and finally Ryan, dressed like he was already in mourning, with a girlfriend trailing behind him who whispered near the barn door, "Is that the sailboat?" Ryan said something back too quiet for Arthur to hear, but he saw Sam's jaw tighten from across the yard. Around 1:30, Diane tapped a spoon gently against her glass, and the room settled into silence. She stood beside a large framed photo from their wedding day. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft and practiced. Arthur wanted the people he loves around him while he still has the strength to enjoy it. Arthur had never said that. These last few weeks have taught me how fragile life truly is, Diane continued, one hand pressed lightly against her chest. Arthur gave me a home, a family, a future. He always said this place, this business, everything, should stay with the people who truly love him. Ruth stood near the back wall, expression carefully blank. Diane kept going. He trusted Ryan and me to protect everything he built. I know, deep down, he'd want it to stay in the family. There it was. Not grief. A performance, built carefully in front of witnesses, meant to become the story everyone remembered later. Arthur pushed himself up out of his chair. Sam moved to help him, but Arthur shook his head gently. He wanted to stand on his own. The room quieted as he stepped forward, leaning on his cane. Diane's smile faltered for just a second. Honey, you really don't have to say anything. Yes, Arthur said. I do. Now, before we go any further, if you haven't already, tap that subscribe button and share this video with someone who has ever had to fight for the truth in their own family, because what Arthur says next is the reason this story is worth telling at all. Arthur turned to face the room full of people who thought they were saying goodbye to him. Thank you all for coming, he said. Diane invited you here to say farewell. But before anyone does that, I need you to hear something first. Diane's smile disappeared completely. Sam picked up a small speaker sitting on the bookshelf and pressed play. Diane's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. Finally. It's almost over. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A second clip followed, Ryan's voice this time, talking about taking the workshop truck before anyone could stop him. A third recording played, Diane and Ryan discussing the realtor, the sailboat, how quickly they could list the farmhouse once things settled down. Sam stopped the recording. The silence afterward was heavier than anything that had come before it. This is disgusting, Diane said, recovering first, her voice shaking with anger rather than grief now. You recorded private conversations. I recorded conversations I was part of, Arthur said calmly. And Sam remembered what was said in front of him. You were confused, Diane snapped. You were on medication. Ruth stepped forward, unshaken. Arthur was examined and cleared by 2 separate physicians as fully competent, both before and after these documents were signed. Ryan pushed toward the front of the crowd, his face pale. What documents? Arthur looked at him steadily. The company doesn't transfer to your mother. Most of it now belongs to the employees who spent decades building it alongside me. Sam receives the ownership stake he earned years ago and was never given. Everything else has been placed somewhere neither of you can reach it. And the boat? Diane asked, her voice suddenly very small. It's not for sale, Arthur said. It never was. Diane looked around the room, waiting for someone, anyone, to step in and defend her. No one did. Old friends from the boatyard stared at the floor. The pastor pressed his lips into a thin, quiet line. That silence seemed to hurt Diane more than anything Arthur had said. She picked up her purse without another word. Ryan, we are leaving. Ryan hesitated, glancing once at the barn where the sailboat sat, then followed his mother out the door. It slammed hard enough to rattle a photograph hanging in the hallway. Loose hinge, Sam muttered, and a quiet, surprised laugh moved through the room, the first honest sound anyone had made all afternoon. The weeks that followed were not clean or satisfying in the way movies make revenge feel. Diane hired a divorce attorney within 48 hours. She told mutual friends that Arthur had become paranoid and manipulated after his hospital stay. She demanded a second competency evaluation, hoping to prove the documents shouldn't count. So Arthur sat through interview after interview. What day is it? Who is the governor? Can you explain your assets? Do you understand the consequences of divorce? He wanted, more than once, to say he understood the consequences of marriage far less than he understood the consequences of ending one. He kept that thought to himself. His doctors confirmed his competency every time. The notary's careful notes held up. Ruth had documented every decision along the way with almost obsessive precision. The recordings, while not proof of any crime, made it very difficult for anyone to believe Diane's story about devoted, selfless concern. Still, The process wore Arthur down in ways he hadn't expected. There were nights he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by legal envelopes and antibiotic supplies, wondering if it would just be easier to give Diane whatever she wanted so the phone would stop ringing. "I could offer her more," he told Ruth over the phone one evening, "just to make this stop." "That wouldn't be peace," Ruth said gently. "That would be paying for silence, and calling it something kinder." The divorce took just over 4 months. Diane received the share of property she was legally entitled to under their prenuptial agreement, along with time to remove her belongings from the farmhouse. In exchange, she gave up every claim to the boatyard, the employee ownership plan, and the trust Ruth had helped Arthur establish. At their final meeting, sitting across a conference table in downtown Portland, Diane looked tired in a way Arthur had never seen before. "Did you ever love me?" she asked quietly, before signing the last page. Arthur thought about their early dinners, the morning she'd made coffee before he was even awake, the years he genuinely tried to believe they were building something real together. "I loved who I believed you were," he said. She lowered her eyes and signed the papers without another word. Ryan reached out 2 months later, saying his mother had pressured him and things had simply gotten out of hand. There was no real apology in the message, only an explanation. Arthur wrote back once. He told Ryan he had genuinely cared about him, and that Ryan was a grown man responsible for his own choices. He said the door wasn't permanently closed, but it also wasn't going to open for empty gestures. He never heard back. Sam officially stepped back from daily fieldwork that spring, though retirement never suited him. Within a month, he was back at the boatyard 3 days a week, training new apprentices on tools he'd been using since before some of them were born. At the first meeting under the new ownership structure, the staff quietly voted to name the apprentice training program after him. He complained about it for a week and secretly kept every piece of paperwork with his name on it. The old sailboat stayed exactly where it belonged, in the barn, under a canvas cover, waiting for warmer weather. That spring, Arthur finally pulled the cover off and spent an entire Saturday sanding the pale blue trim Helen had insisted on all those years ago. His hands shook more than they used to. He didn't mind. He worked slower these days, but he worked with his own hands, on his own boat, in his own barn, and no one was waiting outside the door to decide what happened to it once he was gone. By early summer, doctors confirmed the infection had fully cleared. Arthur still tired more easily than he used to. His knees ached before it rained. Some mornings his hands trembled too much to hold a coffee cup steady on the first try. He hadn't come out of this younger. He'd come out of it more careful, and somehow, more himself than he'd been in years. He put Helen's photographs back on the mantel, right beside the front door where they used to sit. He kept help around the house, because he wasn't foolish enough to refuse support when he genuinely needed it, but he kept control of his own accounts, his own decisions, his own signature. Once a month, he taught a short class at the community center on small business basics for anyone thinking about starting something from nothing, the way he once had. One evening that fall, Sam and Arthur sat on the back porch watching a group of new apprentices carry lumber into the barn for the next morning's work. 3 days, Sam said eventually, watching the sunset. "That's how much time they told you that you had left. Turned into a pretty long year after all," Arthur said. Sam nodded slowly. "Getting older doesn't mean you're supposed to accept disrespect just because you're afraid of being alone. Sometimes it just means you finally have the nerve to stop accepting it." Arthur thought about that for a long time after Sam left that night. About how easy it had been, for 4 quiet years, to mistake company for love, and noise for companionship. About how close he had come to letting people who saw him as an inheritance decide the final chapter of his own story. If you've ever had to protect your dignity later than you probably should have, you are not alone, and it is never too late to take your story back. If this reached you today, if any part of it felt familiar, do one more thing before you go. Hit subscribe, leave a comment sharing what this story taught you, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that boundaries are not cruelty, they're survival. And remember the people who stay, genuinely stay, when there is absolutely nothing left for them to gain.